Okay, if you want to get a chair, there's a chair there. So okay. Okay, I'm going to sit here just for the purpose of people who are maybe going to watch a recording of it. Okay, and I'm heard a bit quicker here. Okay, so maybe cross through your. We're right underneath your plan. If you want to get paper out, we'll probably. I'm gonna first of all give you tips on how to answer this question, how to broadly answer the question, what things to do and what things not to do. And you might want to take some notes on that. And then we'll look at that actual question, and I'll try and talk through how I might answer it, and I'll show maybe a kind of typical paragraph in which I might try and respond to it. And I'll try and highlight what I'm trying to do in the paragraph. Okay? So first of all, these are the typical kind of questions you get. You're going to get 2 questions in the exam, okay? And you'll choose one of them. And each question will have a quote. Now, the quote is there for you to maybe pick apart, agree with all of the quote, disagree with some of the quote, agree with part of the quote, or disagree with all of the quote. Because the idea is that you're trying to come up with 5 or 6 contradictory statements or paragraphs that look at your 2 texts according to the themes. Okay? So at the heart of Gothic writing is fundamentally moral in outlook, if not in content. Well, you might look, for instance, at what does moral mean, and where do you see moral things in the book? Where do you see immoral things in the book? Is there a difference between Dracula? Is there a difference between the Bloody Chamber? So that's just broadly the style of the question. It will be a quote, and then there will be a key theme underneath, and how far you agree with the statement it will say, or how far you disagree with it. And so that's asking you to come up with 5 or 6 paragraphs. Okay, so let's look at that in some degree. Here's another couple of questions. Sometimes it might be phrased, compare the use and effects of innocence in the Bloody Chamber stories and Dracula. Consider how far you agree with the statement. So you might get how far you agree, that's implying how far do you disagree. But the idea is that you're engaging with the quotes and you're picking the quote apart. And so this kind of question will have each topic sentence for a paragraph will be dealing with that quote in some way and that theme. Okay, now what's really important here is your assessment objectives. The AA3 is worth half of your answer. And so every paragraph should have at least 1 or 2 contextual points to explain things. So because Carter is a feminist writer, she's interested in exploring the X presentation of women. Dracula's readership would have been a Victorian readership who would have had an interest or perhaps an anxiety about X. Okay, because this is a Gothic texts do X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to expect when we mark your essays that your essay is rich in using contexts to explain points, right? That's really, really important. And you don't need massive paragraphs on context in the history of Gothic. Sometimes it can just be a sentence that explains why the text is the way it is. Okay? So to do really well in this text, you must be bringing in context into every paragraph. And you're using context to explain either why the text is the way it is or why it's different to the other text. Okay? So you're constantly using context to explain. Okay? You're going to hit AA5 because each paragraph is going to be doing different things anyway. Okay, AA5 is different interpretations of the text. One of the most useful in that is thinking about different readers over time interpret the text in different ways. which is also a reader's context, which is kind of AA3 as well. So always write this down, always try to bring in how different readers would understand that text differently over time. So an example of that would be a Victorian reader would see in the transformation of Lucy back into her beautiful state as in some way that is a sign of her going to heaven. A Christian Victorian readership will see that text in a Christian way, perhaps, and that event in a Christian way. Okay. A modern feminist reader might see that the only way that Lucy was free was to be vampirized, if you like, and to become a vampire, and that has to be punished, and that she's back under the control of men at the end, is one interpretation. So consider different interpretations of your text from different readers over time. But please try and use context to explain your points. Okay, right. When we talk about this question, it's a tricky question, and a lot of students come out of it thinking, oh, that was a really messy answer. I didn't do very well in it. And of course, it is going to be a messy answer because you're looking at 4 or 5 different ways of seeing the question. And that's perfectly fine. Okay? You're trying to show multiple ways in which that question can be understood. And in order to do that, you have to bring in different contexts. So ideally, you're going to aim for 4 or 5 different paragraphs with 4 or 5 different topic sentences. A really good answer, and I'll try and get an example of 2 sides of this to show you. I'll give you an example of an extract of an essay. A really good answer, I should be able to read the first sentence of every paragraph, and I've got a clear sense of the broad scope of your answer. Okay? I don't really necessarily need to have some conclusion that agrees on one way of seeing the text, but you might have a summative conclusion. But every paragraph, the topic sentence, should give me, in some sense, an indication of how you're answering the quote and the question in a different way. And so I can see, I could almost be able to predict what you're going to write in that paragraph based on that first sentence of your answer. You have to deal with both texts equally. A weaker question will deal only with Dracula for a page and a half, and then only with Bloody Chamber for a page and a half. They want to see comparative and contrast throughout. Remember that you're not just looking for similarities, but you're explaining differences. Many essays that we mark, students only really try to figure out what's connecting the 2 texts, but they don't really think about what's making the text different. And that's equally as valid. Comparisons and contrasts are important. So let's consider your plan. What have you compared and contrasted? Look at your page, right? You might have compared and contrasted the theme of transformation, and you know, you might compare and contrast characters. But have you compared and contrasted, for instance, that one of your genres is a short story and one is a novel? Okay. You can compare the actual genres of your text. Because this book is a novel, novels do this. Because this is a short story, short stories do this. All right, I'm going to talk for about 90 seconds on what short stories do. Right? And if you don't know, hopefully you'll be thinking about the literary context. The Bloody Chamber is a short story collection. It's not a novel. So what are short stories? How are they different to novels? I'm starting now and I'll finish in 90 seconds. So make sure that you know all of the things about a short story. Short stories are shorter than novels. As a result, they're usually only about one thing, one major incident. Okay? They're usually about the most important event rather than a series of events. Short stories often deal with epiphany, a moment of revelation, okay? Where a novel is like a film, a short story is more like a photograph. Okay? Because short stories are brief, they don't tell us everything. They show rather than tell. Short stories are more likely to leave things out rather than tell us everything. We have to interpret what is said. Short stories will do more showing than telling. Short stories will be much more like a poem than a novel's like a poem. So they will use structure more visibly, maybe the use of time. They will use more use of symbolism, more use of repetition. So short stories are much more like a poem than a novel. Now, the short story collection is also a postmodern collection. The literary context is the most important context. Postmodern texts, such as Angela Carter's collection, are often self-referential. They refer to themselves as literary artifacts. They're artificial. They play on intertextuality. You could argue Dracula does as well. Dracula relates to Carmilla and other vampire novels. Postmodern novels will use different kinds of genre. The Bloody Chamber uses fairy stories as well as the Gothic genre. It retells stories that have already been told. So that is the literary context of short stories. You can compare your short story to a novel. And you can compare different interpretations. Okay, so I've talked about what context you should consider. The most important context is the literary context, really. So knowing about your genre, knowing about Gothic, and showing that in your essay would be very good, okay? Remember that you're dealing with Gothic fiction, so make sure that you relate to the Gothic genre. Influences and how the text relates to other texts is also very good context. So yeah, knowing something about Stoker, knowing something about Carter, but be tentative, right? A mark of an A-star student is using tentative language. Write down tentative. Okay, there's 3 words that are tentative. Possibly, perhaps, maybe. This may suggest, this possibly suggests. You aren't an expert on Stoker's life. You didn't live his life, so you don't really know. So you have to be tentative. And examiners say that tentative writers tend to be more likely to be A-star writers. Okay, you'll have a copy of this PowerPoint afterwards. So let's consider this question. Okay, in Gothic literature, transformation is always presented as a positive thing. Now, I would step back from that and look at the quote. Is transformation always positive? Yes, I could argue a paragraph in which I could find positive transformations in both texts. And so I'll have a paragraph from that. Is it always positive? No, there's going to be negative transformations. I'll have a transformation on negatives. Are transformations always positive? I might say, well, are transformations always permanent? Or do people transform back? So I might challenge whether the always side of it is as well. So I'm trying to find 4 or 5 different ways of looking at that. Okay, can you just turn to the person sitting next to you and see what they said in terms of how they might break that question down? Okay, you've got 1 minute. Look at each other's. Okay, right. Now, with a question like transformations, it might also be good to sort of group different paragraphs along the lines of, well, what kinds of transformations do we actually get? It might be worth listing all of the transformations that we can talk about. So can someone help me out with this and see if you can help me? Amani, what transformations do we get in both of these texts? Yeah, so human to animals or animal to human. We might explore that. Fatima, can you give me another transformation? In either of the books that we could explore. We've got animal to human or vice versa. Could you be a bit more specific? Okay, so vampiric transformations, we could explore that. So human to monster. I could almost put that in human to animal because of the way they're described. Can you give me another example of transformation? Right, so from child to adult is another different type of transformation. Is that shown in a positive way in the Bloody Chamber? Yes. Well, we could then compare, you know, is there, we don't perhaps see child to adult in Dracula, but what could we explore or compare in the same light? Right, so we could see a more negative transformation of faith, perhaps. Do we see any other transformations of religion? In a positive or negative way? Both. So where's the positive psychological transformation in the Bloody Chamber? In the actual Bloody Chamber, they have this psychological transformation that she has things, gets into the mind. I don't know how it's going to say. That's what we're trying to look at, isn't it? Yes. So let's consider, how do we explain something that we know? You know, I often hear in class students say, I know what I mean, but I don't know how to say it. You know, and that's what the deal is. That's what you've got to do in exams. And I would argue the simpler the sentence, better, right? Say one thing in a sentence. Don't try and say a number of things in a sentence. So where is there a positive psychological, let's take that then. Let's break it down. A positive psychological transformation in the Bloody Chamber story. Would you help me out? That's really good. I'm going to repeat that just because they won't be picked up at home. So in some way, there's a positive transformation of the protagonist. Try and use the terminology AO1 that you've been taught, by the way, of the protagonist in the Bloody Chamber story. She's had a psychological transformation from passive to active. If we think about that a little bit, who is the narrator of the Bloody Chamber story? Her herself, isn't it? But she's a woman looking back on her naive self. So it's almost a psychological transformation of self-knowledge. She's looking back on her innocence into how she's grown in experience and how she's psychologically changed as a woman in perhaps a positive way. So you could explore how that is not just from girl to woman, but really rather from naivety to experience, that she's looking back on her own sexuality, her own desires, and her own innocence in some ways from a position of experience. So she becomes a much more active rather than passive agent at the beginning. Okay, very good. So to recap so far, what transformations? Animal to human, a transformation of faith, a a transformation of child to adult, a psychological transformation. How many is that? We've got 4. So we've almost got, and then as you're looking at each of those, you're exploring which of these are positive and which of these are negative. So we have one more that could give us another 5th area that we could explore. What other transformations do we get? Transformation of setting. And is that transformation always a positive thing? Where do we see setting changed? It starts and ends in Romania. It starts in the snow in the Borgias Pass, and it ends in the same place. Starts with Jonathan being tempted by 3 vampires, but it ends with the temptation of Van Helsing and 3 vampires, but it ends in the destruction of the 3 vampires, and it ends in the destruction of Dracula. So could we say the setting has been transformed? We say it's in a positive way. It's almost another question that, but you could. The setting is transformed, it's bathed in red sunset lights. So darkness is emphasized at the start of the novel. At the end of the novel, the same setting is transformed into red light. You know how sometimes these subtle differences of transformation require you to know your 2 books really well. Could you add anything to that? So the transformation from entrapment to freedom would be a good one, and possibly a positive one, we could argue, couldn't we? Okay, very good. Well, I tried to have a think of that myself, and perhaps we have looked at that. Some transformations of physical, child to adult. Some transformations perhaps are negative. Lucy into vampire. Mina's mark she sees as a negative, guilty sign, doesn't she? Yes. As long as you're clear that the transgression would be almost another question, but as long as you're dealing with how some transgression has led to transformation, and then is that transformation positive or negative? Perfect, yes. Some transformations are one of faith or self-knowledge. So we talked psychological, we talked about the transformations of vampire. Are they always positive, negative? Okay. Now you probably wouldn't use all of those, but initially you're going into that question thinking about 4 or 5 areas that I'm going to explore, compare, and bring in context to explain. Okay. You're trying to stick to the question used. Notice that sometimes I've seen with A-star answers that they give a transformation out of the box, right? And one that I've seen might be that the very Gothic nature of the text has been transformed. And they see that as a positive thing because it refreshes and enhances a very old-fashioned genre and turns it into something new. And you think, oh, that's clever. That is answering the question, but it's not answering the question in an obvious way about theme, vampires, and voluptuous ladies. It's answering a question from a genre point of view. And it's forcing that candidate to write about context, of the literary context. So could someone explain to me how the mere genre of Gothic has been transformed? And it's a positive thing because it's renewed a genre that's very well known and somewhat sort of tired because it's so identified. Yes. Yes, that would be a nice contrast. Dracula strangely seems asexual, doesn't he? He doesn't seem driven by desire. Whereas in traditional Gothic, you could show your knowledge that often these the villains were driven by a kind of sexual desire. Dracula doesn't seem to have that. What else is the chief transformation that Stoker's done in Dracula? that marks it out as different to earlier Gothic novels, so that you can show your literary context? Yeah, that's a really good point. So Van Helsing, being Catholic, is now seen as the hero, where Catholicism was often the villain in early Gothic. If anything, the transformations of faith in Dracula is a transformation to Catholicism. Jonathan believes in the crucifix by the end of the novel, which he didn't believe at the beginning. And so you can see that Catholicism almost is, and maybe that might be due to Stoker's Irish hidden Catholicism. You could argue what else about Dracula? Absolutely. So rather than set in Gothic in the past, it's set directly in contemporary times with phonographs, railways, and things like that. We can see transformation of gender. The damsel in distress is now a man. You can see other transformations as well. It moves from castles to the city. The locations become much more different. Whereas the Bloody Chamber transformations, what happens to the Lady Vampire? She becomes human. She's transformed. Carter transforms her stories. They're not necessarily about villains, but rather about self-discovery. Why? Why does she give us fairy stories that change? Why? What's Carter's intentions? Very good. Any answer should talk about what are Stoker's intentions, what are Carter's intentions, apostrophe S, because then you're dealing with AO5. Okay, Carter appears to be suggesting that, you know, vampires don't have to stick in that one role, that women don't have to stick in a role that's been assigned to them. They can break out. So what I'm trying to explain about this question, it's requiring you to think on your feet. Okay, it's requiring you to take a theme and a quote and break it apart and agree with it, agree with part of it, disagree with it, disagree with a part of it, agree with maybe a section of it, but qualify that and explain why. This is because this is Carter doing this. This is because this is a Victorian novel. This is because this is a female feminist writer doing that. Okay, so you're constantly thinking about context to explain. Okay. Here are some sort of topic sentences I tried to come up with about transformation. And what I'm forcing myself to do with the first one is I'm forcing myself to think about both texts. And I'm not going to explain anything in the first topic sentence. I'm just highlighting that that there's a difference in the transformation of female sexuality. Stoker sees it as monstrous, and Carter seems to celebrate it as one of self-discovery. So this topic paragraph will be about the transformation, the sexual transformation of characters, from perhaps naivety to sexual desire. I could simply say both writers show the transformation of sexual desire. Stop there. Okay, but some topic sentences that sort of give me a hint of where the comparison's going, they're forcing the writer to stick to the comparison as well, to compare and contrast both texts. And this topic sentence is forcing me to deal with both texts in the same paragraph. If my paragraph gets too long, I simply start another paragraph and keep the same topic sentence and say, Carter additionally seems to deal with this. Okay, but I think try and have comparative paragraphs is the way forward. Well, I always say to students, you're writing for an hour A4, you should at least write 3 sides, okay? And A-star students will typically write 4 and a bit sides, okay? So you want to train yourself to write fast. It's underestimated, but it's like athletes. They don't just get fast quickly. You've got to write, and that means handwriting and getting into the practice of it. And I would say if you're typing out in class notes, you're not practicing handwriting. So it can't be underestimated, the handwriting speed. Okay, so I don't know. It depends, but maybe about half a page each section. The second one, Dracula can be interpreted as a novel of religious transformation, particularly for Jonathan. Carter, however, takes a more negative view of the transformative effect of religion. So I will then start writing about Dracula and give 2 or 3 examples, and I will give one context to explain why the novel Dracula should be is seen in this way. Can I just make a point? At university, they told us if you write about the novel, you should underline it. Because, so I should have underlined that, by the way, because I'm talking about the novel, the eponymous novel. Right, like eponymous means named after a character, Macbeth, Dracula, Frankenstein. So that we're not confusing that with the character. I'm talking about the novel there, so I should have underlined it. In both texts, the transformation into vampirism, while negative, is not seen as a permanent state. Therefore, it's not always entirely negative. Which paragraph would you find the most difficult to continue writing? If you think the topic sentence number 1 is the most challenging to write, put your hand up. If you think topic sentence number 2, Dracula can be interpreted as a novel of religious transformation, do you think that's the most difficult one to write? Put your hand up. If you think the third one is the most difficult one to write, put your hand up. Probably about equal. Okay, let's consider for a minute or 2. How would you justify the third one? In both texts, the transformation of into vampirism is negative, but not always. How could you challenge that? So you might support that, but how could you sometimes challenge it? You talk amongst yourselves about where you would go, having that as your topic sentence. What would you continue? Okay, right. You're thinking on your feet. The best thing you can do is to have a topic sentence that in some way answers the question. Now, I just wrote this just before the tutorial, and I was worried that I didn't know if I was answering the question well enough. The question is about transformations are always positive. So my topic sentence is, well, transformations into vampirism do seem to be presented as negative. So I want to argue that, and that's easy to argue. I'm going to look at Lucy as, I'm going to look at the 3 vampires. I'm going to look at Mina and how there's a sense of guilt and her soul in danger. And so it's easy to sort of say. And I'm going to say, well, why is it negative? Well, a Victorian readership are going to see it as negative. Any sense of female behaviour that's overly sexualised lacks propriety and goes against the morals of the time. Transformation into the Blofer lady is obviously anti-maternal. It goes against the heart of what they felt Victorian women should be. And notice that I've used individual words. You don't need to use big quotes from the novel. But perhaps the transformation of vampires, I'm starting to think, well, vampires don't stay vampires in any of the books. They transform back. And so this is where I can say that, well, transformations are not always negative. Transformations are positive because of the impermanent state of the transformation. So the three vampires transform back at the end. And recently we had our lesson in one of my classes, and they're described as in repose, calm. Okay? Lucy is described as beautiful again. So the suggestion is they are saved in a Christian sense, that transformation is a positive. So within this paragraph, I'm almost contradicting myself, which is fine also. You can have a topic sentence saying transformations are negative and then support that, but you can say actually sometimes transformations aren't permanent and you can go backwards. And you can say actually it's a positive the way that they are described. And then you're bringing in the comparison with the lady in the House of Love. But her comparison, she doesn't get more beautiful at the end. It's a contrast. She, if anything, gets older, less beautiful, and more human, which is a significant quote in relation to the other ones. And then I bring in Carter's intention. So I'm getting a mark for AA5. I'm highlighting the fact that she's a second wave feminist and she's wanting to offer a positive transformation to highlight that we should not accept the position to which we're born. The lady in the House of Love has all her ancestors looking down on her, trapping her as a vampire. But by becoming human, she breaks out of that cage. And that's a message that feminist writer would want to write for other women. And why have I used that reference to break out of the cage in relation to that particular story? Yeah. Exactly. And sometimes an A-star student won't necessarily talk about it, but they will show to the examiner that they're hinting at more knowledge than they're actually saying. One of the interesting things the chief examiner said to me when we went to a kind of training session with like OCR, 34,000 students nationally will take the OCR English Literature exam. And the chief examiner, I said, what's the difference between an A-star student's response and an A-grade student response? And he surprised me. He said that an A-star response will be shorter than an A-grade response. And I always thought like a longer answer would be better. And he said, no, it's because an A-star response will hint at more than they say. They will hint at their knowledge more than they actually say. And again, they're hinting here perhaps that there's other things in that story to remind us of that. They perhaps will make more points in fewer words than an A-grade answer. And a B-grade answer might be longer again, but will retell the story to get to the point. Okay? You don't really get marks for retelling the story to get to the point. Okay, so I've got a couple of context points in there. I'm going to finish by, I dug out someone's writing last year. They're not here, but hopefully they're here. And you're really trying to focus on the context points, right? They wrote this in lower six, and so it would have been in time conditions. What I've done is, can you highlight where they use context? And I kind of, as you read it, I've put a C by where they use context. And it would be worth seeing visually on the page how often a student uses context. So while you're in the zone, we'll ask you to read it now, get a highlighter up, and see how someone responds. Is everyone fine with it? So you're just highlighting where they've used a context reference to explain. Because I want you to see visually how often you should be referencing context. And as you highlight, can you figure out which of those 5 contexts they're referring to there? Okay, so we're looking at roughly about three or four, maybe about 4 a page. Okay, now if you take that over 3 pages, you're hitting a lot of different contexts there, and that's what the visual reminder you want to have in mind. Okay, right, so that really brings me to the end of our presentation. I'll make the video available should you need it. Does anyone have any questions before we finish that they want to ask? Yes. I would say about 27 out of 30. Sorry, I didn't hear your question. Well, we're looking at it's alternating. There certain Thursdays become available and certain Thursdays are training sessions. So yeah, we're trying to be putting some on that are going to be open to lower and upper 6 next term, probably every 2 or 3 weeks, I think. Otherwise, it would be one-to-one tutorials with your tutor. If we do them, I'll try and encourage teachers to video them. So if you're not able to, or you should have to go to another class, to try and make them available via Teams. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, I'll try and dig one out. Well, I suppose referring to the cage is like hinting at your knowledge of the other parts of the text without saying it. Okay. Talking about the female vampires is not, it's not an original idea in that it's been used previously. You can do that. I'll find examples.